Hello and welcome back to At the Symposium. Today we're going to be talking about negation. All right, so here we are back on our series on Jean-Paul Sartre's Being in Nothingness. Last week we talked about the first chapter entitled Pursuing Being. And what we got from that is we're kind of starting to explore Sartre's idea of consciousness and what it means to be a being. So, as I mentioned in the last video, the start of this book is kind of an exploration into phenomenology. Phenomenology is kind of the study of existence and phenomena and events, existence, consciousness. How do things kind of emerge, right? So Sartre's effort here is to try to figure out how consciousness emerges. And he's going to do this in a way, as I mentioned in the previous video, that is kind of developed all throughout the book. Okay, so it's kind of in a way, it's written in a kind of conversational way. I told you in the last video that it's kind of discursive. It is because he makes qualifying statements, but then he kind of challenges them, and then he'll change his view, and because it's kind of conversational. He's going through a conversation with you as a reader. He's also taking some conversations in with some other prominent philosophers, some of his time and some of years past. And that's exactly what he starts to do here in the first page of The Origin of Negation. This is page 33. Now we're just going to be covering the first part of this chapter. So this first part of this part of the book. So this is I believe it's what do you want to say? This is going to be part 1, chapter 1, Origins of Negation. And then this is going to go into nothingness. Now, I'm not going to cover nothingness today. We're going to do that next week because that's a little bit broader. So what we're going to do here is going to do negation. Then we're going to do nothingness next week. And after that, we'll do bad faith because that's another integral concept in Sartre's exploration in phenomenology. So what he does here on page 33 is he speaks to one of those earlier philosophers, René Descartes, because he's trying to get away from this notion of the kind of mind-body dualism. If we remember anything in Philosophy 101, we have René Descartes, the I think, therefore I am statement, the kind of exploration of the mind and body. It's referred to as mind-body dualism. But of course, as I mentioned in the last video, if we take Descartes' stance on that and juxtapose it with what Sartre's trying to do, we can tell that it's not compatible, really, because what Sartre's trying to do is he's really trying to break it down at each level and really explore these things. To say I think therefore I am would be too hasty of a conjecture or a statement to make for Sartre, especially at this stage, right? So I'm just going to read some of the introductory lines and then we'll get into the chapter. So he says, our inquiry has led us to the heart of being, but we have been brought to an impasse since we have not been able to establish the connection between the two regions of being which we have discovered. And remember, that is the in itself and the for itself. If we recall from the last video, the in itself is just being as such. The for itself is something necessarily that kind of recognizes another being or can recognize another being. So how I like to talk about the in itself is like it's easier to get grasp this concept if we relate it to like an inanimate object, like a rock. Like a rock doesn't know itself to exist, but it does exist. How do we know it exists? Well, we're going to say, especially in this vein of phenomenology, we're going to say that it exists because there's a being in which can recognize its existence. Okay, but what we're trying to go into here in negation is how does that being recognize that existence? Okay, so that's the two regions of being that he's talking about: the in itself and the for itself. He says, no doubt that this is because we have chosen an unfortunate approach. Okay, so now he's disqualifying our approach. He says, yeah, we're trying to get somewhere, but it might not be the right path to go. Descartes found himself faced with this analogous problem when he had to deal with the relation between the soul and the body. Okay. He planned then to look for the solution on that level where the union of thinking substance and extended substance was actually affected, that is, in the imagination. His advice is valuable. To be sure, our concern is not of Descartes, and we do not conceive of imagination as he did. But we can retain what we can retain is the reminder that it is not profitable first to separate the two terms of a relation in order to try to join them together again later. The relation is a synthesis. And that's what's going to be valuable here, because this is what Descartes, and even Hegel, Heidegger, and some Husserl, these are all people in the field of phenomenology. And phenomenology is very much about this dialectic. And this is why I love this chapter. If you remember in the last video, I talked about the fact that this was one of my favorite chapters in the book. Part of that is because it's kind of the most dense when it comes to his kind of whole dialectical approach and outlook. And the dialectic is something I find really intriguing. Also because it has something to do really with math and science as well. So the dialectic doesn't just exist in a philosophic context. Again, in phenomenology, a lot of this stuff kind of relates to other disciplines because it has to do with consciousness, perception, how we realize things, just as much as we could talk about the science. Science is how we realize a hypothesis, how we realize nature, how we realize observation, how we realize numbers in math. Okay. But he says here he doesn't want to separate them, again, because he says this is a synthesis. This is the whole objective here, is to kind of see how things synthesize. It's not to say that one thing is over the other or one thing happens even before the other. Maybe things happen simultaneously. Again, this is kind of the dialectical approach. The next page he starts to talk about a little bit about Heidegger, and one of Heidegger's kind of main phrases in his lexicon, and one of his main ideas is this idea of being in the world. Okay, so Sartre's going to take that and he's going to say, well, he's going to ask a couple questions about being in the world. He says, it is by the description of this totality that we shall be able to reply to these two questions. What is the synthetic nature, or what is the synthetic relation which we can call being in the world? What must man in the world be in order for a relation between them to be possible? What must man and the world be in order for a relation to be possible? In truth, the two questions are interdependent, and we cannot hope to reply to them separately. Again, okay, see, that's his whole pool is to have a dialectical conversation. Not to say that any of these things have separation towards each other, but there are things that happen in science simultaneously, and there are things that are in dialogue with each other. We're going to go now into where he starts kind of breaking down his idea of negation and what that is. Before I go any further, though, I do want to mention something that I haven't mentioned yet, in that since this book is a large book and it has a lot of special terms, there's actually a glossary in this book. It's in the back of the book, and you can find Any of these words that you might not be familiar with, it's likely in the back of the book. So we're going to cover two different definitions here that he talks about. We're going to cover negate or negation, and then we're going to cover nihilation. Okay. So negation, Sartre's word for types of human activity, which while not obviously involving a negative judgment, nevertheless contains negativity as an integral part of their structure, i.e. experiences involving absence, change, interrogation, destruction. Okay, that's what we're talking about here with negation. But Sartre, as we're going to see in this next chapter, or in this next page that we're going to cover, that Sartre kind of makes an effort. Part of the first pages of his writing on negation is to kind of separate it from this idea of judgment, because he's going to be, when he talks about negation, he's really talking about, right, something negative, right? And when we hear something negative, we hear something that's judgmental, right? But what he's trying to kind of do is to say that, yeah, there might be judgmental, qualitative senses to this word, but that's not really what I'm talking about. There's more here to this idea of negation. It's not necessarily a judgment. Now we have nihilate or nihilation, a word coined by Sartre. Consciousness exists as consciousness by making a nothingness, arising between it and the object of which it is conscious. Thus, nihilation is that by which consciousness exists. To nihilate is to encase with a shell of non-being. And if we can just hold that in our heads for a second, and as we get through the next couple pages, hopefully that starts to resonate with us. So here's Sartre on negation and his idea of negation here. Every question presupposes a being who questions and a being which is questioned. This is not the original relation of man to being in itself, but rather it stands within the limitations of this relation and takes it for granted. On the other hand, this being which we question about something. What about which I question, the being participates in a transcendence of being. I question being about its ways of being or about its being. From this point of view, the question is kind of an expectation. I expect a reply from a being or from the being questioned. That is, on this basis of a pre-interrogative familiarity with being. I expect from this being a revelation of its being or of its way of being. To reply will be a yes or a no. It is the existence of these two equally objective and contrary possibilities which on principle distinguishes the question from affirmation or negation. All right, so basically is just laying out the kind of linguistic nature of yes and no. This has to do with affirmation or negation, right? It is evident that no being always appears. It is evident that non-being always appears within the limits of a human expectation. It is because I expect to find 1,500 francs that I find only 1,300 francs. It is because a physicist expects a certain verification of his hypothesis that nature can tell him no. It would be in vain to deny that negation appears on the original basis of a relation of man to the world. The world does not disclose its non-being to one who has not first posited them as possibilities. All right, so that kind of gets to the heart of it. This is page 38. It kind of gets to the heart of his whole notion of negation and of this dialectic, right? So it's not that there's non-being or a state of negation, something negative out in the world, but it has to be first understood by someone or something to make it a possibility to be realized, to kind of see it out there in the world. Okay, so he takes this example of just money in his wallet. He says, well, I expect to be 1,500 francs, and the only reason why I can figure out why there aren't 1,500 francs is because, well, there's only 1,300 francs, and it's this expectation of having a certain number, a certain quantity, that I can then realize a lesser quantity. So in a way, you can say that there's, as he's saying here, an aspect of comparison, an aspect of expectation, but also an aspect of comparison. That there is some being out here that has the ability to compare and to draw expectations upon the in itself, right? Like the Franks would, just like the rock I said, for example, external objects we can think of very easily as in itself. These in itself objects which are just there, well, there's a being that interfaces with them, that makes judgments about them, comparisons about them, brings them into the world of negation. Here he goes on to kind of talk about his idea of judgment and how he's trying to get around this idea of judgment and negation. So he's going to give us an example of natural disaster. And what I think it's kind of funny, this is the first line he says here, but it's quite a perspective. He talks about natural disaster and destruction. He says destruction presents the same structure as the question. In a sense, certainly, man is the only being of whom a destruction can be accomplished. Let's see why he says that. So Sartre says man is the only one that can destroy anything. He says a storm does not destroy, or at least they do not destroy directly. They merely modify the distribution of mass of beings. There is no less after the storm than before. There is something else. Okay, now this might sound ludicrous to some, but this gets kind of the heart of what he's trying to get at. I don't know if he really believes this literally, but there is a way. I mean, this is a perspective to have. That let's say the wind blows and a palm falls off on a palm tree. That tree might have one less palm, but the palm still exists. It's just in a different place. The tree doesn't necessarily think of itself as destroyed. There's nothing in itself that's saying anything is destroyed. The contents of the world have just necessarily changed order. They've just moved in a different geological position. But they still exist. And not even anything about its character is necessarily changed at that point. It takes something for itself to witness those things and to make some kind of judgment about them. Even this expression is improper. For to posit otherness, there must be a witness who can retain the past in some manner and compare it to the present in the form of no longer. All right. So this is, again, back to the example. He's saying, like, look, there has to be, we can't just even say that this is just something that happens in itself. It also happens because there's a for itself being that also even has this capacity to look into its own memory and compare it to what he says here, what it was the past, which is no longer, right? So if that palm was already on the ground before I realized it was on the tree, of course I could always assume so. But if it was already on the ground, I wouldn't consider anything to have been destroyed. It would have just been the nature of the circumstance of what I saw emerge out of the world at that time. And this is going to actually take us to Sartre's next example, because he's going to get into his transcendence, and he's going to get into how he realizes, or how we realize things. And again, we have to be kind of gracious here. I know some of the stuff might sound absurd to a degree, because this is not how we talk necessarily. This is not how we really visualize things, because this is kind of to do phenomenology, to really understand the breadth of what he's talking about here. You kind of have to peer into the world and take a view of consciousness before judgment and prejudice, essentially, right? Before value, because this is what he's talking about with destruction. There's a being for itself. There's a being that's there putting judgments on these things to be able to come to that conclusion. And they're getting judgments based upon things like their memory and being able to compare things in the past and present and such. But he's going to get into an example that's going to run all throughout this book, in the next page, having to do with a character that he starts to bring in named Pierre. Now, again, he runs through this book all throughout. It's usually Pierre in a cafe, a very cliche kind of Frenchman scene, right? It's Pierre. He's in a cafe, and he's talking about how he's going to see Pierre at the cafe, and he expects him to be there. Okay, he's going to use Pierre in other examples. Pierre's going to be an integral part of the literature going on. In order for destruction to exist, there must be first a relation of man to being, i.e. a transcendence, and within the limits of this relation, it is necessary that man apprehend one being as destructible, right? So we have to see things as destructible for them to be destructed, which destructible or destruction would be some kind of negation. This supposes a limiting cutting into being by a being, which, as we saw in connection with truth, is already a process of annihilation. Okay, now we're going to get into the conversation with Pierre. Okay, let's figure out how he realizes Pierre. He's going to talk about how he realizes Pierre and how he kind of becomes disappointed that he doesn't find his friend at the cafe. He says, similarly, Pierre's actual presence in a place which I do not know is also a plenitude of being. We seem to have found fullness everywhere, but we must observe that in perception there is always the construction of a figure on the ground. No one object, no group of objects is especially designed to be organized as specifically either ground or figure. All depends on the direction of my attention. When I enter into the cafe in search of Pierre, there there is formed a synthetic organization of all the objects in the cafe on the ground of which Pierre is given as about to appear. This organization of the cafe as the ground in which is an original annihilation. Each element of this setting, a person, a table, a chair, attempts to isolate itself, to lift itself upon the ground constituted by the totality of the other objects, only to fall back once more into the undifferentiation of this ground. It melts into the ground. For the ground is that which is seen only in addition, that which is the object of a purely marginal attention. Thus, the original annihilation of all the figures which appear and are swallowed up into the total neutrality of a ground is the necessary condition for the appearance of the principal figure, which is here the person of Pierre. This annihilation is given to my intuition. I am witness to the successive disappearance of all the objects which I look at, in particular of the faces which detain me for an instant and which as quickly decompose precisely because they are not the face of Pierre. Nevertheless, if I should finally discover Pierre, my intuition would be fulfilled by a solid element. I would be suddenly arrested by his face, and the whole cafe would organize itself around him as a discrete presence. But now Pierre is not here. This does not mean that I discover his absence in some precise point in the establishment. In fact, Pierre is absent from the whole cafe. His absence fixes the cafe in its evanescence. The cafe remains ground. It persists in offering itself as an undifferentiated totality to my only marginal attention. It slips into the background. It pursues its annihilation. Only it makes itself ground for a determined figure. It carries the figure everywhere in front of it, presents the figure everywhere to me. This figure, which slips constantly between my look and the solid, real objects of the cafe, is precisely perpetual disappearance. It is Pierre raising himself as nothingness on the grounds of annihilation of that cafe, so that is offered to my intuition is a flickering of nothingness. It is the nothingness of the ground, the annihilation of which summons and demands the appearance of the figure, and it is the figure, the nothingness, which slips as a nothing to the surface of the ground. It serves as a foundation for the judgment Pierre is not here. It is the fact that the intuitive apprehension of a double annihilation. To be here, Pierre's absence supposes a original relation between me and this cafe. There is an infinity of people who are without any relation with this cafe for want of a real expectation which establishes their absence. But to be exact, I myself expected to see Pierre, and my expectation has caused the absence of Pierre to happen as a real event concerning this cafe. Okay. So again, here we get into the thrust of what he's talking about and his perspective on on how he's kind of breaking down, you know, moments of consciousness, moments of realization, and moments of focus. And it's always very hard for me to deny this. And I'm not saying that like this is, you know, solid gold here. But what I mean is that if we just look at our everyday experiences, and this is very much what he's talking about, you know, looking for someone in a cafe, something like that, we can tell that this is very much the way our consciousness works, and you know, in a lot of ways. I mean, it's just very true to the nature of our being when we go somewhere and we're fixated on seeing something. But his point is a little bit deeper here, because as you see in this last part, he says, "But to be exact, I myself expected to see Pierre, and my expectation has caused the absence of Pierre to happen as a real event concerning this cafe." Right. So we're saying like the in itself, maybe even the in itself of that situation, which is just the objective world out there, is codified and substantiated by the for itself, gazing onto it and making judgments about it and for what it wants to see and what it doesn't want to see, what it doesn't care about and what it expected to see and what it desired. Okay. So this is kind of Sartre's whole play on consciousness. Is, you know, I had a professor one time who kind of described it as, you know, Sartre has this kind of empty consciousness, and it's always consciousness of something. There's something, consciousness has to always be consciousness of something. There's always some kind of interplay there. So this is kind of very much where you see that kind of dynamic coming out. Now here he's going to have some ending statements that's going to kind of take us into his next conversation, which then takes negation a little bit deeper into the field of nothingness. So again, if you see this kind of progression, we're starting from the pursuit of being. What is being? Okay, being is in itself, for itself. But then what is negation? How do we realize things? Well, we realize it through negation. Okay. But if we say there's negation that exists, this thing of a negative quality where we can deny things or reject things, then there has to be some connotation to nothingness. Okay. So now what is nothingness? So we're going to start the conversation next for the dialectical concept of nothingness. This is going to be part 3 of chapter 3 of this part of the book. I'm just going to read to you some of the closing statements as he takes us into what's going to be the dialectical concept of nothingness. But where does nothingness come from? If it is the original condition of the questioning attitude, and more generally of all philosophical and scientific inquiry, what is the original relation of the human being to nothingness? What is the original annihilating conduct? That's what we'll talk about next week, Sunday, at the symposium. Thank you. And just real quick, I just want to get back to you guys. I appreciate you watching the series. And I just want to inform you that I'm actually probably going to start coming out with some other things during the week, just because some of the stuff we're going to cover on Sundays is going to take so much of our time, especially this being in nothingness and other books that I have that I'm wanting to cover. It's really going to take up all the time we have on Sundays. So I'm going to be checking in sometimes during the week and doing some short videos on some topics that I want to touch and keep in contact with. So be on the lookout for that. Otherwise, I'll see you on the next round. Have a good one.